In 1337, the year your Europa Universalis campaign begins, France is the largest and one of the richest realms in Western Europe. It stretches from the gray waters of the Channel down to the sun-bleached shores of the Mediterranean, from the rocky coasts of Brittany to the alpine passes on the road to Italy. On a strategy game map, this is a solid block of blue, dense with provinces and promises. In reality, it is far less simple. France is not yet a tightly centralized state. It is a patchwork of fiefs, duchies, counties, and churchlands. The king rules in theory from the Seine Valley, from Paris, and the royal domain around it, but in practice, he must constantly negotiate with powerful lords. The dukes of Burgundy and Brittany, the counts of Flanders, the princes of the south. Each has his own castles, his own advisors, his own men-at-arms. They are proud princes who accept the crown's authority only so far as it suits them. On the throne sits Philip VI of Valois. He is the first king of a new branch of the royal family, the Valois line. The old Capetian line ends when Charles IV dies on the 1st of February 1328 without a surviving son. A few months later, in late May 1328, Philip is anointed and crowned in Reims, as tradition demands. His claim as a cousin of the last kings is recognized by the great lords of France, but it is not unchallenged. Across the Channel in England, another monarch watches closely. Edward III, King of England, and more importantly for France, Duke of Aquitaine. Aquitaine, often called Guyenne and Gascony in contemporary sources, is a rich block of territory in the southwest, centered on Bordeaux. It produces wine on a colossal scale and ships it north in long convoys that hug the Atlantic coastline. English merchants buy that wine and pay for it with wool from their flocks, which Flemish weavers in the Low Countries turn into cloth. It is a triangle of money and goods: English wool, Flemish cloth, French and Gascon wine, that feeds the treasuries of both kings and the prosperity of several regions. The problem is that Aquitaine is, in feudal law, a French fief. The King of England holds it not as an independent sovereign, but as a vassal of the King of France. That means, in law, that the English king must kneel and swear homage to the French king for lands that are effectively a major part of his own economic base. It is as if the economic heart of the realm were held at the pleasure of its rival. The history behind this situation reaches back to the 12th century. Through the marriage of Henry II of England to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the English crown acquired vast holdings on the continent: Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, and more. French kings have been cutting away at this block for generations using war, diplomacy, and the legal instruments of feudal superiority. By 1337, only a core remains in the southwest, but it is still enough to threaten French sovereignty. In a Europa Universalis campaign beginning in 1337, that core appears as a narrow strip of English-held land around Bordeaux, hugging the Atlantic coast and stretching southward. To the French crown, it looks like a foreign dagger pointed deep into the body of the realm. There is another, more delicate problem. Edward III of England is not some distant stranger. Through his mother, Isabella of France, he is the grandson of a French king, Philip IV. When Charles IV dies on the 1st of February 1328, Edward II acquires a path, however contested, to the French throne. Later, French jurists would argue that an ancient Salic law had always barred women, and therefore their sons, from inheriting the crown. In 1328, however, there is no single written rule that everyone agrees on. There are precedents, opinions, and above all, political fears. Many in the French political community dread the idea of an English king ruling both realms at once. The great lords and prelates therefore choose Philip of Valois as king and state that the crown cannot pass through a woman and therefore cannot pass to Isabella's son, What will later be dressed up as a clear legal principle is, in its moment, a political decision. Philip VI takes the throne, but he inherits a difficult position. He must assert his authority over fiefs that do not always obey, keep the papacy and the great Italian banking houses on good terms with the crown, and watch the movements of his English cousin. At the same time, economic tensions simmer. The cities of Flanders, rich and crowded, depend heavily on English wool for their cloth industry. The Count of Flanders is formally a vassal of the French king. His loyalties pull him towards Paris. His merchants look across the Channel. For a few years, the situation holds. There are diplomatic quarrels, local skirmishes, tense embassies, but no open war between the two crowns. The year 1337 represents the moment when this balance finally breaks. In the first years after 1337, much of what matters still happens within France itself. The crown must secure its vassals, watch the English in Aquitaine and along the Channel coast, and decide how forcefully to answer the gathering crisis over Gascony. Chapter 2: Claims, Confiscations, and the Road to War. The immediate trigger of the conflict that we call the 100 Years' War is not a dramatic battle, but a legal and diplomatic escalation over Gascony. In the early 1330s, relations between Philip VI and Edward III deteriorate. The French king supports Scotland, England's traditional enemy, and interferes in the Low Countries. The English king, in turn, gives refuge to Robert of Artois. Robert is no ordinary exile. For years he had been one of Philip's closest allies and cousins, but he ruined himself by forging documents to claim the county of Artois from his aunt Mahaut. After a long legal battle and a highly public trial for forgery in the early 1330s, he is condemned. In 1334, he is finally driven from the kingdom. From England, he urges Edward to take a hard line against Philip, and repays his enemies with advice, information, and relentless encouragement for war. Philip VI decides to use the legal weapon that generations of French kings have relied on: confiscation. On 24 May 1337, he announces that the Duchy of Aquitaine, in practice, Gascony, and the remaining English lands in the southwest, is forfeit to the crown because Edward has failed in his obligations as a vassal and has harbored Philip's enemy. The arrière-ban, the great feudal summons to arms, is proclaimed throughout France. Lords are ordered to muster, and the kingdom begins to prepare for war. On the English side, Philip's move is seen as an attack on the honor and vital interests of the crown. Gascony is too valuable to lose. Its wine exports bring in customs duties, its harbors provide bases for fleets. To give it up without a fight would be a humiliation that might undermine Edward's legitimacy at home. Edward answers not by accepting judgment, but by attacking the very basis of Philip's authority. If the French king invokes feudal rights, the English king questions whether he is truly king. In 1340, Edward formally adopts the title King of France and adds the lilies of France to his coat of arms. His argument is clear. As grandson of Philip IV through his mother, he claims that his right to the throne is better than that of Philip of Valois. For many historians, this is the moment when the quarrel shifts from a dispute over a single fief to a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the French crown. In the real Europe of the 14th century, it transforms a feudal lawsuit into a dynastic war. From now on, this is not just about one duchy. It is about who has the right to rule the richest kingdom in Western Christendom. While the legal arguments unfold, both sides look for allies. Philip VI leans on the traditional friendship with Scotland and seeks support from the maritime kingdom of Castile, whose ships might challenge the English at sea. Edward III turns to the princes of the Low Countries and to some German rulers, hoping that subsidies and promises will bring them into his orbit. Flanders is a special case. Its cloth towns, Bruges, Ghent, Ypres are hungry for English wool. The Count of Flanders, Louis III, remains loyal to Philip and even enforces an embargo on the export of wool to England. For the weavers and merchants in his cities, this is ruinous. Discontent rises and political factions in Flanders begin to look favorably on an English alliance. The outlines of a wider conflict, one that reaches into the North Sea trade routes, are forming. From the perspective of the French crown, this diplomatic chess is dangerous. If England builds a strong coalition in the Low Countries and secures naval dominance, it can land armies anywhere along the coastline, in Normandy, in Picardy, even nearby, the mouth of the Seine. The channel, which in peaceful years acts as a barrier, could become a highway for invasion. Yet in 1337 and the immediate years after, the war remains limited. To contemporaries, it often resembles a dangerous border crisis more than an all-consuming cataclysm. There are raids in Gascony, clashes at sea, skirmishes in Flanders. Armies move, but there is no decisive campaign. The first phase looks in retrospect like a long opening act in which the full weight of the conflict has not yet crashed down on the kingdom. That changes when Edward decides to use his navy aggressively. If he can destroy the French fleet, he will not only secure his communications with Flanders, but also remove any threat of French invasion of England itself. On 24 June 1340, the two fleets finally meet off the port of Sluys, in the estuary that leads towards Bruges and Ghent. The French ships, commanded by Hugues Quiéret and Nicolas Béhuchet, have chained many of their vessels together in three great lines and strengthened them with wooden fighting castles, palisades of spars and casks, and rigged netting to hinder boarders. They intend to fight as a floating fortress. The English fleet, led in person by Edward III, approaches with the wind and the sun behind it. The battle that follows is brutal and largely one-sided. English archers and men-at-arms swarm the French decks. Once they have seized a few of the chained ships, gaps open in the defensive line. Many French vessels are boarded and captured, others sink with most of their crews. Contemporary and modern estimates suggest that between 16 and 20,000 French sailors and soldiers may have died in the fighting or by drowning. At Sluys, France loses the bulk of its war fleet in a single day. From that point on, the English control the Channel. The threat of a French landing in England fades. The danger of English armies appearing on French soil grows. The seas around the northern coast are no longer safe. It is a turning point. The war will now be fought again and again on French ground. Chapter 3: Chevauchée, Crécy, and the fall of Calais. Some years later, with the Channel secured after Sluys, Edward III begins to plan larger expeditions to the continent. His goals are several: to support allies in Flanders, to pressure the French crown by devastating its lands, and when possible, to bring Philip VI to a pitched battle on favorable terms. In the early 1340s, these efforts are constrained by money. War is expensive, and the English crown depends on parliamentary grants and loans from Italian bankers. When funds are short, campaigns are delayed, soldiers go unpaid, and momentum is lost. This is the less glamorous side of medieval warfare. Stalled campaigns, impatient creditors, and kings forced into delicate negotiations with their own elites. It is not until 1346 that Edward is able to mount a major invasion. He lands in Normandy with a large army, including his son, the Prince of Wales. The man later remembered as the Black Prince. The landing catches the French off guard. Caen, a wealthy city, falls to the invaders after only brief resistance. English troops fan out across the countryside, burning, looting, and tearing down the symbols of royal authority. This strategy of widespread devastation has a name: the chevauchée. Rather than besiege every fortress, the English ride through the land, destroying crops, mills, and storehouses, and ruining the tax base that supports the French monarchy. They also intend to provoke Philip VI, a king cannot forever tolerate the destruction of his subjects' livelihoods without making an effort to stop it. In the chronicles of the time, a chevauchée appears as a trail of smoke and fear stretching across the countryside. Burned farms, empty granaries, frightened towns closing their gates. Philip VI gathers his forces and pursues Edward across northern France, trying to bring him to battle before he can escape. The English king, for his part, wants to fight only on ground of his choosing. He moves north and east, crossing rivers with difficulty, at one point passing dangerously close to Paris itself while looking for a bridge that is still standing. Eventually, unable to shake pursuit, Edward halts near the village of Crécy en Poitiers and orders his army to prepare defensive positions on a gentle slope. The date is 26 August 1346. Modern historians estimate that he commands perhaps 12 to 13,000 men. Philip's host may be 2 or 3 times larger, somewhere around 30 to 40,000, though exact numbers are uncertain. The English line is drawn on rising ground with plowed, rain-softened fields before it, and patches of marshy terrain and hedged enclosures channeling any advance. The army is well supplied with longbowmen, infantry, and a smaller contingent of mounted men-at-arms. The French host contains the heavy cavalry of the nobility, infantry levies, and mercenary crossbowmen from Genoa. The battle that follows becomes one of the most famous of the Middle Ages. The Genoese crossbowmen are sent forward first, but they advance tired and with damp bowstrings after a long march in bad weather. Under a hail of English arrows, they falter and fall back. French knights, enraged, ride them down as cowards and turn the confusion into slaughter. Then come the great cavalry charges. Wave after wave of French men-at-arms attempt to force their way up the slope. But the ground is churned to mud, the approach is narrowed by hedges and ditches, and the English longbowmen fire dense volleys into advancing horses and riders. Knights fall, formations break. The momentum of the charge dies before it can reach the English line. Among those who die is John of Bohemia, a veteran prince who has been blind for about a decade after losing his sight during a campaign in 1336. At Crécy, he insists on taking part. According to later chroniclers, he has his horse's reins tied to those of his companions so that he can be led into the thick of the fight. All are killed together. By the end of the day, large numbers of the French nobility lie dead. Counts, barons, and bannerets. The English hold the field. Crécy is a devastating defeat for Philip VI and a clear demonstration that the old style of frontal noble charges, however glorious, can fail catastrophically against disciplined infantry and massed archery, especially when the terrain favors the defenders. Edward does not march on Paris after Crécy. Instead, he moves north to the port of Calais and begins a long, methodical siege. Calais sits close to the narrowest point of the Channel, a strategic coastal town whose people now face months of hunger and bombardment. The siege begins in September 1346 and lasts until August 1347. The English strangle the town by sea and land. Attempts by the French crown to relieve Calais fail. As the months stretch into nearly a year, starvation gnaws at the defenders and the civilian population alike. Later tradition remembers one scene above all others. When the town finally surrenders, 6 leading citizens, the burghers of Calais, led by Eustache de Saint-Pierre, come out barefoot, wearing only shirts and with ropes around their necks, carrying the keys of the city. They offer their lives to save the rest of the townspeople. Edward, angered by the long resistance, is said to be ready to have them executed, but his queen, Philippa of Hainault, pleads for mercy. He relents and spares them. In practice, the outcome remains harsh. Edward expels most of the inhabitants and replaces them with settlers from England. Calais becomes an English stronghold, a permanent gateway onto the continent. For France, the loss of Calais is more than a military setback. It symbolizes a new reality. The English can land armies at will, sustain them through a secure harbor, and use this foothold to interfere in northern France for generations. Calais will remain in English hands until the mid-16th century, a symbol of England's long presence on the northern French coast. Yet even as the English achieve spectacular victories, the wider context of Europe shifts. A far greater catastrophe than any battle is approaching, one that will strike both kingdoms. Chapter 4, Plague, Crisis, and a Kingdom. Strained about a decade after Crécy, in 1347, ships carrying grain, goods, and something far more deadly begin to arrive in Mediterranean ports. From the Black Sea, the disease later known as the Black Death reaches Sicily. The port of Messina is one of the first recorded entry points, and then spreads with terrifying speed along trade routes. By 1348, it has reached Marseille, Avignon, and Paris. By 1348 to 1350, it sweeps across most of Western Europe, including France and England. Contemporary chroniclers struggled to describe the scale of the disaster. Villages are abandoned, cities see their churchyards overflow, and entire families vanish within weeks. Modern estimates suggest that France as a whole may lose between 30 and 50% of its population, with great regional variation. Paris, perhaps a city of around 100,000 before the plague, may lose about half its inhabitants. For the French crown, already under pressure from war, the plague is a blow to manpower, tax income, and the basic functioning of society. In more abstract terms, it is a sudden collapse in population and productivity. On the ground, it means empty fields, quiet villages, and a pervasive sense of dread. Armies disband not only because they are defeated, but because there are simply fewer men to levy and fewer resources to feed them. The immediate effect is a pause in large-scale campaigning. Both sides struggle with the consequences of the epidemic. In the longer term, however, the demographic shock alters the balance between those who own land and those who work it. With fewer peasants and laborers available, surviving workers can, in many regions, demand better terms and higher wages. Lords, desperate to preserve their rents and accustomed privileges, often resist, sometimes through new ordinances that try to freeze wages or bind peasants more tightly to the land. Tension between social classes increases. In France, the stresses of prolonged war, heavy taxation, roaming bands of soldiers, and social change culminate in open unrest. Royal officials, sent out into the provinces to collect subsidies for the war and repay debts, are unpopular. Banditry and local violence spread. The plague also weakens the authority of the church in the eyes of some contemporaries. Prayers and processions do not stop the disease. Holy men die like everyone else. This does not suddenly secularize society, but it contributes to a climate of questioning and anxiety that will shape politics in the troubled decade to come. For the kingdom, the Black Death becomes the background to every decision. Fewer troops can be raised, and the economic base is damaged. Stability is harder to maintain. That, in essence, is how the real France of the 1350s lives, exhausted by war, wounded by plague, and yet still required to field armies to defend its remaining territories against an enemy who has by no means finished. Chapter 5, Poitiers, Captivity, and the Treaty of Bretigny. In the mid-1350s, the focus of the war shifts again to southwestern France. Edward III's son, the Black Prince, leads an English army on another chevauchée through Poitou and the surrounding regions. The French king at this time is John II, called John the Good, who has succeeded Philip VI. Determined not to repeat the perceived passivity of his predecessor, John rides out at the head of a large force to intercept the raiders. The two armies meet near Poitiers on 19th of September 1356. Once again, the English choose a strong defensive position, using hedges, ditches, and broken terrain to protect their flanks. Once again, they are heavily supplied with longbowmen. John II commands a numerically superior force and decides to attack rather than starve the English out. The Battle of Poitiers ends, like Crécy, in a French disaster. Repeated assaults fail to break the English line. In the confusion of close combat and failed charges, portions of the French army break and flee. The most shocking outcome is not simply the loss of many nobles, but the capture of the king himself. John II is taken prisoner and eventually transported to England. For a medieval monarchy, the king is more than a general. He is the keystone of legitimacy. His capture throws the kingdom into a crisis of governance. John's son, the Dauphin Charles, becomes regent. He must face not only the continuing English threat, but also deep unrest at home. In Paris, the merchant leader Etienne Marcel, provost of the merchants and head of the city's political community, becomes the voice of urban discontent. He demands reforms in royal finances, more control over taxation, and a greater say for the Estates General in how the kingdom is governed. For a time, Marcel and the Dauphin work together uneasily. The Great Ordinance of 1357 promises oversight of royal officers and limits on arbitrary taxation. At the same time, in the countryside north of the capital, a violent peasant uprising known as the Jacquerie breaks out in late May 1358. Between roughly 21 May and June, villagers and smallholders, enraged by taxes, war damage, and the brutalities of roaming soldiers, attack noble houses, kill knights and their families, and burn manors. Some urban groups in and around Paris make contact with the rebels, hoping to combine pressure from town and country. The nobility retaliate with even greater ferocity, slaughtering thousands of peasants once they regain the initiative. The urban and rural revolts are not a single movement, but for a brief moment their energies overlap. Discontented Parisians and desperate villagers both challenge the existing order. The Dauphin, balancing between factions, eventually moves against Marcel. On 31st July 1358, Etienne Marcel is killed at the gate of Saint-Antoine by royal partisans while attempting to admit troops of Charles of Navarre into Paris. With his death, the urban revolution is broken. Amid this turmoil, the English use their advantage at the negotiating table. The captive John II is treated with ceremonial respect in London, but held firmly until terms can be agreed. In 1360, after years of intermittent talks and campaigning, the Treaty of Bretigny is concluded near Chartres on 8 May, and later ratified at Calais on 24 October. Its terms are harsh for France. Large territories in the southwest and west, including most of Guyenne and Gascony, Poitou, Saintonge, Périgord, Limousin, Crécy, Rouergue, Montauban, Agenais, Angoumois, and Aulnay, are ceded outright to England to be held in full sovereignty rather than as fiefs of the French crown. In exchange, Edward III formally renounces, at least on parchment, his claim to the crown of France. A heavy ransom is set for the release of King John II, originally 4 million gold écus, later reduced to 3 million, to be paid in several large installments over a period of years. Hostages from the French nobility, including John's own son, are to guarantee payment. The sums involved are enormous, straining royal finances and requiring new and unpopular taxes. In political and territorial terms, Bretigny marks the moment when several rich regions formally pass into English hands, and a crushing indemnity is imposed on the French crown. The military balance of the previous 2 decades has been translated into concrete concessions. For France, the treaty appears almost like a defeat. The kingdom has lost ground, its finances are strained, its people are weary, and its king must return periodically to English custody when payments falter. Yet the story of the 100 Years' War does not end here. The next phase of the conflict will see a surprising reversal, driven in large part by the man who has weathered the crisis as regent, Charles, soon to be Charles V, and by his chosen captains, such as Bertrand du Guesclin. Chapter 6, A Glimpse Ahead. France. After Bretigny, By the spring and autumn of 1360, when the Treaty of Bretigny is agreed and then ratified, France looks beaten. Vast territories in the west and southwest are ceded to England. The king has spent years in foreign captivity, and whole regions are scarred by war, plague, and rebellion. On parchment, the map seems to confirm defeat. English color spreads inland from the Atlantic like a stain, and the royal domain appears smaller than at any time in living memory. Yet the kingdom is not broken. Beneath the surface, men and women continue to work the fields, repair bridges, and reopen markets. Towns that were burned begin slowly to rebuild. Trade in wool, cloth, and wine, the triangle linking English pastures, Flemish looms, and the vineyards of Gascony and the Loire, never entirely disappears. Even battered, it continues to tie together the economies of France, England, and the Low Countries. The crown, in the hands of the Regent Charles, learns hard lessons from the disasters of Crécy and Poitiers. Charging recklessly into prepared positions has cost too many lives. Trusting entirely in feudal levies and noble cavalry has proved dangerous. Out of necessity, French warfare begins to change. Commanders pay more attention to fortresses, supply lines, and the slow work of sieges. Ambitious captains rise who are less interested in glory on the open field and more in wearing down the enemy over years. In the 1360s, when Charles becomes King Charles V, he governs cautiously but effectively. From centers such as Paris and, in troubled times, Bourges, he reorganizes royal finances, makes more systematic use of permanent taxes, and invests in specialist administrators and notaries. Rather than seeking great set-piece battles, he prefers to avoid them, relying instead on smaller, carefully chosen operations. One of his key instruments is the Breton knight Bertrand du Guesclin. Du Guesclin excels at hard, patient campaigning, sieges, ambushes, and the slow clearing of enemy garrisons. Step by step, French forces under his command and that of other captains chip away at the English holdings created by Bretigny. By the time Charles V dies in 1380, much of the territory formerly ceded in 1360 has been brought back under French control, not through one decisive clash, but through a long series of local successes. For ordinary people, however, the war does not vanish. It settles into a grim rhythm. Periods of open campaigning alternate with uneasy lulls in which unpaid mercenaries, the free companies, roam the countryside, or local feuds flare up into violence. Taxes bite deeper, but so too does a sense that the kingdom must hold together if it is to survive. The memory of lost lands and captured kings lingers in villages and courts alike. Seen from 1337, all of this lies ahead. The defeats and the treaties, the plague and the uprisings, but also the slow strengthening of royal power and the emergence of new ways of fighting. France is about to enter a long ordeal in which it will lose battles, provinces, and kings, yet out of that ordeal will come a more resilient monarchy, better able to defend its lands and interests. On the map, the blue of France will shrink and expand over the decades, but the idea of the kingdom endures. The legal quarrels over Gascony, the fields of Crécy and Poitiers, the burghers of Calais, the plague-stricken streets of Paris, and the cautious strategies of Charles V and Du Guesclin all become layers in the same story. Chapter 7. Charles V and the Art of Recovery. In 1360, when the ink dries on the Treaty of Bretigny, it looks as if the long quarrel between the kings of France and England is settling into a lasting English advantage. Vast territories in the southwest and west are ceded in full sovereignty to the English crown. Heavy ransoms and indemnities weigh on the French treasury. The prestige of the monarchy has been shaken by defeats and captivity. Yet within a single generation, the balance will tilt again. The architect of this reversal is Charles V of France, later known as Charles the Wise. During the years of his father John II's imprisonment, he has already proven his ability to navigate crisis. As regent, he has faced revolts in Paris, the peasant uprising of the Jacquerie, and the constant threat of renewed English intervention. When John dies in 1364, Charles formally inherits a kingdom reduced in territory, but rich in bitter experience. Charles V does not seek glory on the battlefield. Unlike many of his predecessors, he rarely leads an army in person. He is physically frail and often ill. His strength lies in patience, calculation, and a deep understanding of administration. His instinct is to rebuild, to stabilize, and to wage a cautious, almost mathematical kind of war. One of his first tasks is to restore royal authority at home. The civil conflicts of the 1350s have shown how dangerous great cities and noble factions can be when the crown is weak. Charles works to regularize taxation, relying on more predictable indirect taxes and long-term grants rather than emergency levies alone. He surrounds himself with capable counselors, jurists, and financiers who can enforce royal policy across the realm and slowly rebuild confidence in royal government. At the same time, he must confront a new menace, the so-called free companies, bands of mercenaries left idle by truces and peace settlements. These hardened soldiers, often foreign, roam the countryside in armed groups, holding castles for ransom, plundering villages, extorting towns. They are a scourge on the rural population and a standing reminder of how fragile peace can be. Charles turns this problem into an opportunity. Where possible, he hires these companies into royal service and sends them away from the heart of the kingdom. Some are redirected into foreign wars, most famously into the conflict in Castile. Others are broken up by targeted campaigns led by trusted captains. Step by step, royal forces reassert control over regions that had grown used to lawless violence. The Castilian adventure will prove costly for the English. In 1366 to 1367, Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, leads an expedition to support Pedro I of Castile, called the Cruel, against his half-brother, Henry of Trastamara, who is backed by the French and by Bertrand du Guesclin. The campaign culminates in the Battle of Nájera on 3 April 1367, a tactical victory for the Black Prince, but a ruinously expensive one. To pay his debts, he imposes new taxes on his subjects in Aquitaine. Resentment there deepens. Charles V follows these developments closely. The Treaty of Bretigny had recognized Edward III as an independent prince in his expanded French lands, not as a vassal. On parchment, this looks like a clean division of authority. In practice, the enlarged Principality of Aquitaine is a patchwork of lordships, each with its own customs and grievances. Many local nobles and towns dislike being ruled from afar, and dislike even more the new financial burdens imposed to fund campaigns in Spain. Appeals and complaints begin to reach the French royal court. Charles's lawyers are eager to listen. The king makes use of one of the most subtle weapons at his disposal, the royal court of justice. When Gascon lords appeal to him against decisions taken by the Black Prince's administration, he accepts their cases. By doing so, he quietly asserts that he still has ultimate authority in these lands despite the treaty. To Edward III and his son, this is a clear provocation. To Charles V, it is a way to reopen, through law, what seemed to have been settled by arms. The strain grows. In 1369, after years of rising tension and appeals, Charles declares that Edward has failed to respect the obligations of Bretigny and that the Duchy of Aquitaine is therefore confiscated. Once again, legal language provides the formal spark for renewed war. This time, however, the balance of power is different from 1337. England is overextended, war-weary, and facing its own internal strains. France, under Charles V, is more stable than it has been for decades. The king has re-established a measure of fiscal order and surrounded himself with a cadre of reliable captains, the most famous of whom is Bertrand du Guesclin. Du Guesclin, a Breton noble of rough appearance and blunt manners, is no courtly tournament hero. Chroniclers describe him as stocky and unglamorous, but they also stress his tenacity and tactical sense. He understands that England's advantage lies in set-piece battles in which longbowmen can be deployed to full effect. Accordingly, he avoids such confrontations whenever possible. Instead, under Charles's direction, the war becomes one of sieges, raids, and attrition. French forces chip away at English garrisons, retake towns and castles by surprise or negotiation, and encourage local revolts. The famous longbow is of little use in a fortress that changes hands without a pitched battle. Naval actions and economic pressure play their part as well. The old triangle of English wool, Flemish cloth, and French wine, the trade routes that tie the Channel ports, Flanders, and the Southwest together, becomes a field for customs wars, privateering, and diplomatic pressure. Control of key ports and river mouths is as valuable as any single battlefield success. In Castile, too, the tide turns. After Nájera, Henry of Trastamara regroups with French and Aragonese support. Du Guesclin, ransomed from English captivity, fights again on Henry's side. By 1369, Henry has overthrown Pedro and secured the Castilian throne. The new king's alliance with France helps to keep English influence on the Iberian Peninsula in check. Through the 1370s, English power in France contracts. Rather than risking everything on a single confrontation, Charles V and Du Guesclin follow a policy of the war of small steps, sieges, local offensives, and carefully chosen defensive positions. English strongholds fall one by one. By the time Charles dies in 1380, most of the territories ceded at Bretigny, apart from Calais and a reduced enclave in Gascony, have been brought back under the authority of the Valois crown. Charles V leaves a kingdom still scarred by war and plague, but significantly recovered. The treasury is in better order, the royal administration more coherent, and the English threat reduced to pockets along the Channel and in the southwest. Yet the settlement is fragile. His heir, Charles VI, is only 11 years old. The next phase of the war will be shaped not just by the clash between France and England, but by the storms that will break within France itself. Chapter 8: Charles VI, Madness and Civil War. When Charles VI succeeds his father in 1380, he is only 11 years old. For a time, his uncles, the Dukes of Anjou, Berry, and Burgundy, govern in his name. As he grows older and begins his personal rule, there is a brief moment of hope. The memory of recent disasters is still fresh, and the machinery of government built by Charles V continues to function. Beneath the surface, however, tensions are already present. A new generation of royal uncles and cousins, the Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, and Orléans among them, compete for influence, offices, and revenue. Court factions form around great houses. The costs of past wars and ongoing defense still weigh heavily on the kingdom, and ordinary people resent taxation. In the summer of 1392, a single event changes the course of the reign. While leading a punitive expedition towards Brittany, Charles VI suffers what contemporaries describe as a terrifying fit of madness in a forest near Le Mans. Suddenly, he draws his sword and attacks members of his own escort, killing 4 or 5 men before he can be restrained. Chroniclers record this moment as the first clear break in the king's mind. After this episode, periods of lucidity alternate with months in which the king does not recognize his own wife and children, or falls into delusions. The most famous of these is the so-called glass delusion. Charles becomes convinced that his body is made of glass and could shatter at a touch. He refuses to be touched, has iron rods sewn into his clothing to protect him, and sometimes will not move for fear of breaking. For his subjects, the image of a king who believes himself fragile glass becomes a cruel arceau, metaphor for the fragility of royal authority. Modern historians debate the exact nature of Charles VI's illness, but whatever its medical explanation, its political consequences are clear. France's king is no longer a reliable decision-maker. Royal authority, carefully rebuilt over decades, suddenly lacks a steady hand at its center. In this vacuum, the great princes move to take control. Two broad factions emerge. On one side stand the supporters of the king's brother Louis, Duke of Orleans, who wield considerable influence during the monarch's episodes of incapacity. On the other stand the Burgundians, led first by Philip the Bold and later by his son John the Fearless. At first, the rivalry expresses itself in competition for offices, revenue, and access to the king. Gradually, it takes on a sharper ideological and propagandistic edge. Pamphlets, sermons, and commissioned treatises portray the opposing side as corrupt, tyrannical, or dangerously soft on England. The Dukes of Burgundy, whose power base stretches from eastern France into the wealthy cities of Flanders and the Low Countries, have economic interests that do not always align with those of princes rooted in the Île-de-France or the Loire Valley. The conflict explodes into open violence in 1407. On 23 November of that year, Louis of Orleans is ambushed and murdered in the streets of Paris by men acting on the orders of John the Fearless. The killing is shocking even by the standards of the age. Yet John does not deny responsibility. Instead, he commissions theologians and jurists, most famously the preacher Jean Petit, to produce a formal justification arguing that the Duke of Orleans was a tyrant whose elimination was necessary for the salvation of the realm. From this point, political rivalry hardens into civil war. Supporters of the murdered Duke and later of his son Charles of Orleans rally around the party that will be called Armagnac, after one of its leading allies, Bernard VII, Count of Armagnac. The adherents of Burgundy retain their old name. France, still formally at war with England, is now also split internally between Armagnacs and Burgundians. The consequences are devastating. Cities and regions choose sides, local feuds intertwine with great power politics. Armed bands fight in the streets of Paris and other towns. Paris itself experiences violent swings of control, with massacres of political opponents leaving deep scars in urban memory. Royal authority, already weakened by Charles VI's illness, is fragmented still further as each faction claims to act in the king's name. For England, this internal French conflict presents both danger and opportunity. On one hand, a fractured France may make it harder to negotiate a comprehensive peace. On the other, it offers openings for intervention. A determined English king might exploit the divisions of his enemy to press old claims anew. On 21 March 1413, he succeeds his father, Henry IV, aged in his mid-20s, inheriting not only his ancestors' titles, but also their unfinished ambitions in France. Unlike his ailing father, Henry is energetic, militarily experienced, and keenly aware of the advantage that a divided France may offer him. Chapter 9, Henry V and the Road to Agincourt. Henry V begins his reign by consolidating his position at home. He reconciles with former opponents of his father, restores a measure of order, and strengthens royal authority. Only after securing his domestic base does he turn his attention across the Channel. In France, the civil war between Armagnacs and Burgundians has reached new heights of bitterness. For periods, the Armagnac faction controls the royal government in Paris, but is deeply unpopular among sections of the population. Burgundian influence remains strong in the north and east, and in many cities of the Low Countries. Both sides claim to act in the name of the incapacitated Charles VI. Henry presents himself as both heir to the old Plantagenet claims and as a potential restorer of order. At the negotiating table, his demands are deliberately high. Recognition as heir to the French throne, large territorial concessions in Normandy and elsewhere, and a substantial dowry if he is to marry one of Charles VI's daughters. The French crown, divided and under strain, is unwilling to concede so much. Talks break down. In 1415, Henry decides to enforce his claims by force of arms. In late summer, he assembles an army and sails for Normandy. His first target is the port of Harfleur, controlling the mouth of the Seine. The siege, lasting from August into late September 1415, ends in an English victory, but at a heavy cost. Disease and hardship ravage Henry's army within the trenches as surely as enemy missiles. With the campaigning season advancing and his forces weakened, Henry chooses not to push deep into France immediately. Instead, he resolves to march his army northeastwards to the English stronghold of Calais, a bold move that will require crossing rivers and hostile territory, while French forces gather to intercept him. The French high command, dominated at this point by Armagnac leaders, is eager to avenge Crécy and Poitiers and demonstrate that the kingdom can still field a powerful host. A large army is assembled, drawing in contingents from many regions, heavily armored men-at-arms on horseback and on foot, with supporting infantry and crossbowmen. The English, by contrast, can muster perhaps only 5,000 to 8,000 men, including a few thousand longbowmen, tired, ill, and short of supplies after weeks of marching. The two armies finally confront one another near the village of Agincourt in Picardy on 25 October 1415, the feast of Saints Crispin and Crispinian. The battlefield is cramped, flanked by woods, and soaked by recent rain. The freshly worked clay has turned to thick mud. The English take up a defensive position. In the center stand the men-at-arms. On the flanks, longbowmen drive sharpened stakes into the ground, forming rough palisades to deter cavalry. Behind this improvised hedge of wood and steel, archers wait with strings kept dry under their caps. The French plan is straightforward. Use massed advances of heavily armored men-at-arms to crush the enemy center and overwhelm the archers. But the conditions of the battlefield and the density of their own formations turn against them. As the vanguard advances, it is slowed by mud and by the sheer press of bodies. When English arrows begin to fall, horses are wounded or killed, men are struck and stumble, and those behind trip over those in front. By the time the leading French battalions reach the English line, they are exhausted, compressed, and unable to maneuver or properly use their weapons. The narrow space between the woods funnels more and more men into a killing ground where they cannot deploy their superior numbers. English archers, having emptied their quivers, join the melee with mallets, axes, and knives, attacking from the flanks and rear. Contemporary estimates vary, but many modern historians suggest that a much smaller English army destroyed or captured a far larger French force, with French losses running into the thousands and English casualties relatively light. Among the fallen or captured are many high-born nobles whose absence will be felt for decades. Agincourt becomes, in English memory, a symbol of miraculous victory against the odds. For France, it is another catastrophe, echoing Crécy and Poitiers. And it comes at a time when the kingdom is already weakened by internal conflict. The defeat further undermines confidence in the Armagnac-dominated government and encourages Henry to press his advantage. In the years after Agincourt, Henry campaigns methodically in Normandy. He returns with fresh forces, capturing towns and fortresses, and gradually recreating something like the old Anglo-Norman presence along the Channel and Seine. Local elites, faced with the choice between submission and ruin, make separate arrangements with the English. The network of English-held territory in northern France begins to look less like a raiding foothold and more like an occupation. Meanwhile, relations between Armagnacs and Burgundians grow ever more poisonous. Each faction alternately denounces the English as usurpers and flirts with them as potential allies against its domestic enemies. It is a dangerous game, and one that will soon lead to an extraordinary turning point in the war. Chapter 10: The Treaty of Troyes, and a kingdom. Divided by the late 1410s, France's internal crisis deepens. Paris changes hands between factions. Massacres and purges scar the memory of its inhabitants. In 1418, Burgundian forces seize control of the capital, driving out the Armagnacs in a bloody uprising. The Dauphin Charles, the future Charles, VII, escapes southward, establishing a diminished court along the Loire. In 1419, there is an attempt at reconciliation between the two great factions. John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, and the Dauphin agree to meet on a bridge at Montereau on 10th of September to negotiate. The encounter ends in disaster. During the meeting, as tempers flare and weapons are drawn, John is struck down and killed by men close to the Dauphin. Whether this is a premeditated assassination or a lethal escalation of mutual suspicion remains debated, but its political effect is unmistakable. John's successor, Philip the Good, is outraged. The Burgundian party turns decisively away from the Dauphin and towards an alliance with England. For Henry V, this is the opportunity he has been waiting for. With Burgundian support, he can claim legitimacy in northern France and isolate the Dauphinist court on the Loire. In 1420, negotiations culminate in the Treaty of Troyes, signed on 21st May in the Church of Saint-Jean-au-Marché in Troyes. Its terms are astonishing even by the standards of the age. Charles VI, still nominally king but incapacitated by illness, recognizes Henry V as his heir and regent. The Dauphin Charles is declared disinherited. Shortly afterwards, on 2 June 1420, Henry marries Catherine of Valois, Charles VI's daughter, further binding the dynasties together. According to the logic of the treaty, when Charles VI dies, the crowns of France and England are to be united on Henry's head and subsequently on that of his heirs. Burgundian propagandists hail this as a necessary step to restore order and punish the Dauphin for Montereau. English chroniclers see it as the long-awaited vindication of their king's claims to the French throne. In practice, the situation on the ground is more complex. Large parts of northern and northeastern France recognize the authority of the Anglo-Burgundian regime based in Paris and Rouen. Territories along the Loire, much of the southwest, and other regions continue to support the Dauphin, now often derisively called the King of Bourges after his temporary capital. France is effectively divided into competing political blocs, each claiming legitimacy. The death of Henry V in 1422, only 2 years after Troyes, complicates matters further. He dies suddenly at Vincennes on 31st August while campaigning, leaving his heir an infant son, Henry VI, born in December 1421. Within weeks, Charles VI also dies on 21st October 1422. According to the treaty, the child Henry is now king of both realms. In reality, regents and councils in London and Paris rule in his name, while the Dauphin Charles, uncrowned and excluded from Troyes, continues to claim the title of King of France from his base in the south. The Anglo-Burgundian regime controls rich regions and important cities, but it faces substantial challenges. Maintaining garrisons and paying troops is expensive. Local populations resent foreign soldiers, and heavy taxation, particularly in economically vital areas, bound into the trade of English wool, Flemish cloth, and French grain and wine. The Burgundian dukes, powerful allies, but also rulers with their own interests in the Low Countries and along the Rhine, are not mere subordinates. Their loyalty to the English cause depends on calculations that can change. On the Dauphinist side, morale is low. Many nobles doubt whether the cause can be sustained. Some consider separate deals. Yet amid the discouragement, there are also currents of religious hope and popular expectation. Prophecies circulate that France will be saved by a maiden from the borders of Lorraine. In troubled times, such rumors find a ready audience. It is in this context that one of the most remarkable figures of the entire war steps onto the stage. A young woman from Domremy, later known to history as Joan of Arc. Chapter 11. Joan of Arc and the Turning of the Tide. Joan is born around 1412 in the village of Domremy, on the borderlands between the Kingdom of France and the Empire. Her family are peasants of modest means. By her own later testimony, she begins to experience visions and hear voices in her early teens, voices she identifies as St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. These voices, she says, urge her to support the Dauphin and help drive the English out of France. To a modern mind, Joan's claims may raise questions that blend psychology, faith, and culture. To her contemporaries, visions and divine messages are not unheard of, but are treated with caution. What makes Joan extraordinary is not only what she claims, but the persistence with which she pursues an audience with those in power. After repeated attempts, she manages in early 1429 to reach the Dauphin's court at Chinon. There, according to several accounts, she impresses Charles and his advisors with her conviction, her piety, and certain specific details she reveals in private conversation. The Dauphin orders inquiries into her orthodoxy at Poitiers. Some counselors remain skeptical, but others argue that in such desperate times, an unusual instrument may be the one Providence has chosen. The Dauphin eventually allows Joan to accompany a relief force to the besieged city of Orléans, a crucial stronghold on the Loire. English and Allied troops have encircled the city since 1428. Its fall would open the way into the heart of the Dauphinist territories. French attempts to break the siege have thus far failed. Joan's arrival is a powerful symbol. Dressed in armor, carrying a banner emblazoned with religious imagery, she is presented not as a war leader in the conventional sense, but as a divinely inspired figure whose presence promises God's favor. Within the city, her appearance lifts morale. Among the besiegers, rumors spread that a holy maid has come to lead the French. In the following days, Joan urges aggressive action. Working with experienced captains such as Dunois and La Hire, she participates in a series of assaults on the English fortifications around Orléans. Contemporary accounts differ in detail about the extent to which she directs tactics, but they agree on her courage and the impact of her example. She is seen at the front of attacks rallying troops even after being wounded. On 8 May 1429, the English lift the siege and withdraw from Orléans. For the Dauphinist cause, this is far more than a local victory. It is a psychological transformation. A cause that had seemed doomed now appears to have received a sign of divine favor. Joan presses for the next step, the formal coronation of Charles as King of France at Reims, the traditional site of royal anointing. Much of the territory between the Loire and Reims is still contested, but a campaign is organized. Towns and fortresses along the route, sensing the shift in fortunes and perhaps influenced by Joan's reputation, open their gates or surrender after brief resistance. On 17 July 1429, Charles is anointed and crowned in Reims Cathedral as Charles VII. Joan stands nearby, holding her banner. The ceremony does not instantly change the military situation, but it has immense symbolic weight. For many subjects, it confirms that the rightful king has been crowned in the customary place, in the sight of God and the Church. In the months that follow, Dauphinist forces attempt to build on their momentum with further campaigns in the Ile-de-France and elsewhere. Not all these ventures succeed. Political caution, logistical difficulties, and disagreements among commanders limit the scope of operations and at times sideline Joan herself. In 1430, while helping to defend the town of Compiègne, Joan is captured during a sortie against Burgundian positions on 23 May. She becomes the prisoner of a vassal of the Duke of Burgundy and is moved between several strongholds. Later that year, she is handed over to the English in exchange for a large payment, recorded in contemporary documents as 10,000 livres tournois, a substantial ransom by the standards of the time. The English and their allies arrange for Joan to be tried before an ecclesiastical court at Rouen, presided over by Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a partisan of the Anglo-Burgundian regime. The proceedings begin in January 1431 and run for months. They focus on questions of heresy, the propriety of her wearing male clothing, and the legitimacy of her visions. Joan, still in her late teens, faces trained theologians who seek to entangle her in doctrinal contradictions. The trial transcripts, unusually well preserved, reveal a young woman of sharp wit and steadfast confidence in her mission. She refuses to abandon her claims to divine guidance or to denounce the voices she believes she has heard. Whatever modern interpretations may say about her experiences, the surviving records show no trace of madness in her answers. Only determination, intelligence, and a keen sense of the political stakes. In May 1431, after a final condemnation, Joan is handed over to the secular authorities and burned at the stake in Rouen on 30th May. Her death is intended to discredit the cause she served by presenting her as a heretic and impostor. Yet over time it has the opposite effect. Stories of her courage and steadfastness spread. For many, she becomes a martyr. Decades later, the Church will reopen the case. In 1456, under Pope Calixtus III, an inquiry declares the original trial null and void, rehabilitating Joan's memory. Centuries after that, in 1920, she will be canonized as a saint. For contemporaries of the 15th century, however, her most immediate legacy is different. She has helped to restore confidence in the Valois cause and to show that the English advance can be reversed. In a strictly military sense, the war does not end with Joan of Arc. But after Orléans and Reims, the tide has turned. The English position in France is increasingly precarious. Their resources are stretched, their domestic politics troubled, and their most powerful continental ally, Burgundy, is beginning to reconsider the value of its alignment with England. Chapter 12. From Castillon to the end of the war. After Joan's death, the conflict enters yet another phase. Charles VII, once derided as the King of Bourges, gradually consolidates his authority. Reforms in taxation and military organization begin to bear fruit. The Crown establishes more permanent, centrally controlled units of troops, a step towards a standing army that can be deployed more reliably than feudal levies or ad hoc mercenary bands. In 1435, a diplomatic breakthrough reshapes the strategic landscape. At a congress in Arras, representatives of France, Burgundy, and other powers meet to negotiate. The result is a reconciliation between Charles VII and Philip the Good. Burgundy formally breaks its alliance with England and recognizes Charles as King of France. In return, the Duke receives concessions and confirmation of his extensive possessions. For contemporaries, this shift is one of the decisive political events of the later war. It deprives the English of their strongest continental ally and reshapes the map of loyalties in northern France. Without Burgundian support, the English hold on northern France becomes more fragile. French forces, now more unified, can concentrate their efforts on reducing English garrisons. Over the next 2 decades, a series of campaigns gradually erodes the English presence. Towns and fortresses fall in Normandy and the Ile-de-France. In 1430, Paris itself returns to French control. The process is not swift. It involves sieges, negotiations, local uprisings, and carefully staged offensives. But the direction is clear. In England, political instability further undermines the war effort. Henry VI, the child who inherited his father's claims under the Treaty of Troyes, grows into a gentle but indecisive ruler. Rival noble factions struggle for influence around him, setting the stage for the internal conflicts later known as the Wars of the Roses. The resources available for campaigning in France diminish, and public enthusiasm for the costly Continental War wanes. The final act of the Hundred Years' War is often associated with 1453 and the Battle of Castillon in Gascony. There, on the 17 July 1453, a French army equipped with substantial field artillery confronts an English force under John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, long one of England's most capable commanders. The French position is protected by earthworks and gun emplacements prepared by master gunner Jean Bureau and his colleagues. When Talbot, seeking to relieve the besieged town of Castillon, attacks before his full force has assembled, his troops advance into the killing zone of the French guns. Contemporary accounts and modern estimates suggest that the French field perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 men, including artillery specialists, while the English may number 6,000 to 8,000. What makes the battle distinctive is not the exact size of the armies, but the decisive role of artillery. French guns tear gaps in the attacking English formations. Attempts to storm the fortified camp are thrown back with heavy losses. In the fighting, Talbot himself is killed and his army is shattered. In the months that follow, Bordeaux and the remaining English strongholds in the region surrender. With their fall, almost all the territories once held by the English crown in France are lost. Only Calais remains under English control, an enclave that will stay in English hands until 1558, long after the memory of Castillon has faded from most minds. By the middle of the 15th century, the war that began in 1337 has effectively burned itself out, though no single definitive peace treaty closes it in one neat line. Instead, exhaustion, shifting priorities, and the de facto realities on the ground bring the long struggle to a close. England turns inward and towards other theaters. France concentrates on rebuilding and integrating the territories it has brought back under the royal banner. The effects of the 100 Years' War on France are profound. Large regions have suffered repeated campaigns, sieges, and devastations. Populations have been displaced, fields gone untilled, trade routes disrupted. Yet out of this long ordeal, a stronger sense of the kingdom as a unified entity begins to emerge. The crown develops more centralized institutions, more regular means of raising taxes and armies, and a clearer sense of its own sovereignty, even if the modern concept of a nation-state still lies centuries in the future. Economically, the war has reshaped patterns of trade and production. The old triangle of English wool, Flemish cloth, and French wine and grain has been strained by blockades, shifting alliances, and fiscal demands. New centers of production and exchange rise as others decline. Some towns never recover from repeated sackings. Others, like Bordeaux and Rouen, eventually find new roles within a more firmly French royal framework. For England, the end of the war marks the collapse of centuries-old continental ambitions. The kings who once ruled vast lands in Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine now retain only a single continental foothold. The prestige of claiming the title King of France will linger in English royal style for generations, but it becomes increasingly detached from any practical reality. Looking back across the arc from 1337 to 1453, the 100 Years' War appears not as a single continuous blaze, but as a series of fires that flare, die down, and flare again. The France that enters this period is a feudal patchwork, shaken by external pressure and internal strain. The France that emerges is still marked by strong regional identities and powerful nobles, but it is closer to the centralized monarchy that will dominate the early modern era. And yet, beyond battles and treaties, the war leaves behind something harder to measure: memories, legends, and a deepening sense of belonging to a kingdom called France. For those who lived through it, the end did not arrive with a single trumpet blast or a tidy closing formula. It came quietly, in fields plowed again where armies had marched, in houses rebuilt where towns had burned, and in children growing up under a royal authority that, for all its flaws, seemed more present and enduring than it had in 1337. If you open a Europa Universalis campaign at that date, you see only colors and borders. Behind that blue expanse lies the long story you have just heard: the legal quarrels over Gascony, the defeats and recoveries, the fields of Crécy, Poitiers and Agincourt, the voices that stirred a peasant girl from Domremy, and the slow rebuilding of a kingdom from the ruins of war. It is there quietly, every time the map of France appears on the screen, a reminder that every starting date is only the surface of a history far deeper than it first appears.